November 17th, 1983. A black Mercedes moved slowly through rain-soaked streets in Geneva, carrying one of Egypt's most closely guarded men. General Mahmoud Safwat had already lived through 3 assassination attempts. He had spent decades building an intelligence web that stretched across the Middle East. He knew names, routes, payments, and betrayals, the kind of information that could bring down ministers or collapse fragile alliances. Switzerland felt safe to him, neutral territory, a place where old rules still mattered. He trusted that belief. He should not have. Less than an hour later, he would disappear inside a 5-star hotel, leaving no sign of struggle, no witnesses, and no explanation. For the next 48 hours, Egypt's intelligence service would act as if nothing unusual had occurred. The Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva was built for discretion. Its marble lobby had seen diplomats pass arms dealers and intelligence officers pass rivals, all of them pretending not to notice each other. On that night, rain traced thin lines down the tall windows. Guests crossed the lobby in quiet streams. Their voices were swallowed by thick carpets. From the bar nearby came the muted sound of glasses touching. Everything felt controlled. Outside, Geneva moved with its usual order. Trams ran on time. Street cleaners worked through the rain, methodical and unbothered. The city did not rush, and it did not pause. General Mahmoud Safwat arrived at 7:15 in the evening. He stepped through the revolving door with 2 bodyguards close behind him. They were large men, clearly trained, and the door barely held them. At 54 years old, Safwat still carried himself like an active officer. His back was straight, his movements were measured. The civilian suit he wore was well cut and expensive, a sign that he had learned how to operate far from military compounds and briefing rooms. His face was wide, dominated by a heavy mustache that had begun to gray along the edges. His eyes never settled. They moved from doorway to doorway, from reflection to shadow, noting positions and possibilities. That caution was not a habit, it was survival. As deputy director of Egypt's General Intelligence Directorate, known as the Mukhabarat, Safwat controlled operations that ran from Libya to Lebanon. He managed assets in cities most officials never visited. He had placed informants inside Palestinian refugee camps and maintained contact with men who changed loyalties often and without warning. He understood how quickly protection could vanish. Still, standing in that lobby, surrounded by polished stone and quiet luxury, he allowed himself to believe that this place followed different rules. He had spent years building quiet leverage inside rival Arab intelligence services. More risky than that, he kept open lines to Soviet advisors who still remained in Cairo, even after Egypt had turned towards the west following the Camp David Accords.
The peace treaty with Israel, signed 4 years earlier, had changed public rhetoric but not behavior behind the scenes. The shadow war never stopped. Egyptian intelligence tracked Israeli movements across the region as closely as ever. Israeli intelligence answered with the same intensity. Both governments kept up the polite story that they were partners now, while their officers searched for cracks, stole classified material, and, when needed, removed threats before they grew. Safwat arrived in Geneva for a meeting that officially did not exist. On paper, there was no appointment, no delegation, no agenda. A Syrian intermediary had arranged contact with figures tied to a European arms consortium. They were prepared to sell equipment Egypt could not buy in the open market. Washington watched such deals carefully, and Cairo had learned to move sensitive negotiations through indirect routes. Neutral ground mattered. Switzerland, with its reputation for discretion, banking secrecy, and diplomatic distance, was an ideal location. Deals could be discussed without questions, and visitors rarely drew attention. What Safwat did not know was that the Syrians were not behind the meeting at all. The entire setup had been engineered by Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service. The intermediary who reached out to Cairo was a controlled asset, someone who had quietly passed information to Tel Aviv for nearly a decade. By the time Safwat boarded his flight, every part of his trip had already been shared. His flight number, arrival time, hotel name, and room assignment were all known. A Mossad team had arrived in Geneva 3 days earlier and was already in position. The operation had approval from the very top. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir personally reviewed the plan. He weighed the diplomatic risks against the intelligence value of what could be gained. Safwat was believed to hold deep knowledge of Egypt's military posture. That included details on Soviet weapon systems still held by Egyptian units, and, most critical of all, the identities and locations of Mukhabar assets operating inside Israel. This last category had turned urgent and could no longer be ignored. Over the previous 18 months, 3 separate Israeli intelligence operations had been exposed by leaks. Each leak pointed to the same disturbing possibility: someone at a very high level had been compromised. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. According to Mossad analysts, Safwat might be the missing piece. He could know who was feeding information out and how deep the breach went. The team lead was known inside the organization only by his operational name, David. He was 41 years old and had spent close to 2 decades in the field. His work had taken him from Beirut to Buenos Aires and many places in between. He had learned early that standing out was a liability. His look was carefully plain: medium height, brown hair starting to gray.
A face that could blend in as European, Arab, or Latin American, depending on where he was standing. People rarely remembered him after meeting him, which suited him just fine. David spoke 6 languages, not perfectly, but well enough to pass without raising suspicion. More important was his temperament. He stayed steady when things went wrong. Situations that froze other men barely registered on him. That trait had kept him alive more than once. He arrived in Geneva on November 14th using a Canadian passport. The document identified him as a businessman working in telecommunications. Nothing about it invited a second look. He checked into a modest hotel near the train station. He unpacked one suitcase filled with ordinary clothes. No weapons, no electronics that could draw attention. For the first 2 days, he stayed busy but invisible. He conducted quiet surveillance of the Intercontinental and the surrounding area. He walked the nearby streets at different times of day. He memorized the locations of security cameras and blind spots. He learned when the doormen changed shifts and when the cleaning crews came and went. He tracked traffic flow and noted which streets clogged and which stayed clear. By the time the rest of the team arrived, the area felt familiar to him, like a neighborhood he had lived for years. The team was made up of 8 operatives, each with a narrow, defined task. 2 handled logistics. They kept vehicles ready and maintained safe houses. 2 were assigned to surveillance and would track Safwat from the moment he left the airport. 2 served as backup, positioned to step in if anything went wrong. The final 2 were responsible for the extraction itself. Their job was to subdue the general and move him to a secure location where questioning could begin. Those 2 were specialists, 1 man and 1 woman. They had worked together before and trusted each other without hesitation. In operations like this, that mattered more than anything else. Youssef had the solid frame of a wrestler, thick through the shoulders, with hands strong enough to crush a windpipe or slip into a chokehold without hesitation. He had spent years in an elite military unit before moving on to Mossad, and his record included missions that were still classified, even by the standards of the organization itself. People who worked near him knew better than to ask questions. He moved with calm control, conserving energy, always watching. His partner, known within the team as Miriam, seemed to be cut from a different world. She was slim and poised, with dark hair arranged in a style that hinted at European polish. At first glance, she looked like a diplomat's spouse or a gallery owner who spent her days moving between openings and private dinners. She had a way of drawing attention while appearing harmless, the kind of women people remembered without feeling threatened.
That image hid years of training in close combat, pharmacology, and the practiced skill of showing up exactly where no one expected her to be. The operation centered on intercepting Safwat in his hotel room, a space where he would be temporarily separated from his security detail. Egyptian protection procedures required bodyguards to remain stationed in the corridor, not inside the room itself. It was a small weakness, but one David had identified early and planned to use fully. The idea was simple and precise. The team would enter the room using a mix of electronic interference and social engineering, neutralize the general with a fast-acting sedative, and move him out through a service entrance to a vehicle waiting nearby. From the moment of entry to the moment they disappeared, the window was no more than 12 minutes. Every detail had been prepared in advance. In Tel Aviv, Mossad technicians built an exact replica of the electronic lock system used by the Intercontinental. They practiced again and again until bypassing it took less than 30 seconds, even under pressure. Samples of the sedative were obtained and tested repeatedly. Dosages were refined on volunteers to ensure the drug would act quickly without triggering cardiac arrest or other complications. Nothing was left to guesswork. The team also studied the hotel itself. Floor plans were memorized. Former employees were quietly interviewed. Security routines were broken down and mapped until the operatives understood them better than the guards who followed them every day. By the end, the building felt familiar, almost predictable. On the afternoon of November 17th, the team gathered for a final rehearsal inside a warehouse on the outskirts of Geneva. They ran through the sequence step by step, correcting small timing issues and confirming roles. When they finished, there was little to say. Everyone knew what came next, and everyone understood how little room there was for error. They had built a full mock-up of the hotel corridor and the room itself. Furniture stood exactly where intelligence photos showed it should be. Every chair, table, and lamp had been placed with care. Each operative ran through their part again and again. They moved step by step, tested angles, and paused to think through problems that might appear without warning. David stayed off to the side. He watched closely, caught small delays, and pointed out weak spots. When someone hesitated, he stopped them and had them repeat the motion until it felt natural. By the end, the team no longer thought about what came next. Their movements were smooth, practiced, and almost automatic. The rain started around 5 in the afternoon. David noticed it right away and felt relieved. Rain changed how people behaved. Pedestrians rushed along with umbrellas up, eyes down, focused only on staying dry. Cars slowed, lights reflected off the wet pavement, and nothing looked sharp on camera.
Security footage would be smeared with water and glare. For once, the weather was helping instead of getting in the way. At 6:45, the surveillance unit reported in. Safwat's motorcade had left the Egyptian diplomatic mission and was heading toward the hotel. David confirmed the message and gave the signal. The operation was live. 2 operatives sat in a gray Peugeot parked near the service entrance. They looked bored and unremarkable. Inside, 2 more entered the lobby dressed like European businessmen who had just finished a long meeting. Yusuf and Miriam waited in a room on the 4th floor, directly below Safwat's suite. They stood ready, listening, prepared to move the second the order came. The general arrived as expected. His bodyguards spread through the lobby, scanning faces with trained suspicion. They glanced at the men at the bar and moved on. They failed to notice the woman flipping through a magazine near the elevators. They also missed the man near the front door adjusting his umbrella. These details were meant to be missed. Safwat went up to the 5th floor with both bodyguards. The elevator opened onto a quiet corridor with thick carpet and brass wall lights. Framed alpine scenes lined the walls. He stopped at room 517, slid in his keycard, and stepped inside. 1 bodyguard stood watch outside the door. The second waited closer to the elevator bank, where he could see the corridor from both sides. Their stance was alert and practiced. They were ready for problems, though neither believed anything would happen tonight. This was supposed to be routine. 1 floor below them, Yusuf went through his gear for the last time. He did it slowly, the way he always did before an operation. The sedative sat inside a pneumatic injector, already charged and sealed. It was built to fire cleanly through fabric without leaving obvious marks. He checked the pressure, then checked it again. Next came the electronic bypass device. He powered it up, ran a quick diagnostic, and confirmed it was working as expected. No surprises. In the bathroom mirror nearby, Miriam focused on her reflection. She adjusted her hair, softened her posture, and practiced the tired look of someone halfway through a long shift. She no longer resembled a surveillance operative. Now she looked like hotel staff. The uniform had been acquired through channels David preferred not to explain. It fit perfectly, down to the name tag and the faintly strained expression of an employee juggling too many tasks. She looked believable. That was what mattered. At 7:42, David sent the signal to move. No words, just a brief transmission confirming the timing. Miriam left the stairwell carrying a service tray. On it sat a bottle of wine and 2 clean glasses. She walked with purpose but not urgency, the way staff did when they still had several hours left to work.
She stopped in front of the bodyguard outside Safwat's room and offered a polite smile, touched with fatigue. "Complimentary service from the management," she said in French. She angled the tray forward so he could see the label on the bottle. She added that it was for Monsieur Hassan, using the name under which Safwat had made the reservation. It was the kind of detail only hotel staff would know. The bodyguard hesitated. His training told him to be cautious of anything unexpected. Still, nothing about her raised alarms. Her hands were in plain sight, busy holding the tray. The uniform was real. The wine was a respectable Bordeaux, exactly the sort of thing a high-end hotel might send upstairs to a guest booked through diplomatic channels. After a brief pause, he knocked on the door and spoke quickly in Arabic. Seconds later, the door opened. Safwat stood in the doorway wearing a hotel bathrobe. His expression showed mild annoyance at being disturbed. He had been preparing for his meeting, scheduled for 9 o'clock in a private dining room. He glanced at the tray and seemed to relax slightly. The wine, he assumed, was the hotel's way of flattering an important guest. Miriam stepped into the room and set the tray down on a small table by the window. Her movements were calm and routine. the kind that came from long habit rather than urgency. As Safwat turned his back to her to shut the door, she was already acting. With her left hand, she slipped the pneumatic injector out from under the folded napkin on the tray. At the same time, her right hand closed around Safwat's wrist. She twisted sharply, pulling him off balance and turning his body toward her. He barely had time to register what was happening. Before any sound could leave his throat, Miriam pressed the injector against the side of his neck and triggered it. The sedative entered his system at once. Within seconds, his strength drained away. His knees gave out, his eyes rolled back, and awareness vanished from his face. Miriam supported his weight as he collapsed, guiding him down instead of letting him hit the floor. She lowered him onto the carpet carefully, like a medical worker easing a patient into bed. From start to finish, the entire action had taken less than 8 seconds. Out in the corridor, Yusef had come up the stairwell behind the first bodyguard. The man sensed something behind him and started to turn. His hand moved toward the weapon hidden beneath his jacket, guided by reflex and training. He did not get far. Yusef stepped in close, looped an arm around the man's neck, and applied controlled pressure to the carotid artery. The force was exact, measured, and efficient. After roughly 5 seconds, the bodyguard went limp. Yusef eased him down and dragged the unconscious man into the room. Inside, Miriam was already at work again, securing Safwat's wrists with plastic restraints.
She did not look up as Yusef pulled the second bodyguard across the threshold and positioned him out of the way. The final guard, stationed near the elevator, was a different challenge. He had not heard any noise and had seen nothing unusual. Still, his training required him to check on his partner at regular intervals. When he glanced down the corridor and saw no one where there should have been someone, alarm kicked in. His hand went straight for his weapon. He never managed to draw it. 2 operatives who had been waiting in the lobby arrived at that moment, having taken the service stairs to avoid attention. They came up behind him in silence. One locked an arm around his neck in a tight chokehold, while the other delivered a sedative injection with practiced speed. The guard struggled for a brief moment, then his resistance faded. Together they lifted him and carried him back to the room, placing him alongside the others now lying unconscious. David's voice sounded in their earpieces, low and steady. He asked for a status report. Miriam answered without hesitation. The package was secured. 3 subjects had been neutralized. Extraction was next. The team shifted into motion again, each person moving in sync, every step clean, deliberate, and rehearsed. Safwat was placed inside a laundry cart taken from a housekeeping closet. His hands and feet were bound, and his body was hidden under several layers of clean sheets, so nothing showed through. The bodyguards were left in the bathroom, positioned so they would not be found until morning. The empty wine bottle and the glasses were carefully wiped and returned to the table. Anyone entering the room later would assume the general had poured himself a drink before going to bed, and nothing more. Yusef took hold of the cart and began pushing it down the corridor toward the service elevator. His uniform marked him as maintenance staff, the kind of worker no one questions, especially when responding to a plumbing problem in the middle of the night. Miriam moved ahead of him, checking corners and intersections, watching for anyone who might appear at the wrong moment. She made sure the path stayed clear, so the extraction stayed clean and quiet. They rode the elevator down to the basement level. There, the service exit led to a loading dock hidden from the main street and shielded from view. A gray Peugeot was already waiting with the engine running. In less than 90 seconds, Safwat was moved from the cart into the trunk. Padding had been fitted inside, along with a ventilation system designed to keep him alive during transport. The laundry cart was rolled into a storage room nearby and left there. It could sit for days without drawing attention. When the elevator doors finally closed, there was no visible sign that anything unusual had happened. David watched the Peugeot pull away from across the street.
He stayed where he was until it disappeared, then turned and walked toward the train station at an unhurried pace. His part in the operation was finished. What came next would be handled by specialists already waiting at a safe house in the French countryside, just across the border. David would return to Tel Aviv the following morning on a commercial flight. He would travel using a different passport from the one he had used to enter Switzerland, blending back into routine movement. The drive to the safe house took roughly 2 hours. The route avoided main highways and known border checkpoints, sticking to back roads and narrow lanes. The crossing into France was done through a rural path long used by local smugglers, a route passed down for generations and unknown to authorities on either side. By midnight, Safwat had been secured in a basement room at the safe house. The space was equipped with medical monitoring devices and heavy soundproofing. Once the door was closed, he was completely isolated. No outside noise reached him, and nothing from inside could be heard beyond the walls. The next phase was ready to begin. He came back to himself little by little, as the sedative loosened its hold instead of dropping away all at once. Pain came first, not sharp, but constant and irritating. His wrists were strapped tight to the arms of a metal chair. Thick restraints bit into his skin. His ankles were fixed to the chair's legs, leaving him unable to shift his weight or find any relief. The room around him was small and bare. One exposed bulb hung from the ceiling, its light too bright, throwing hard shadows across the concrete walls. There were no windows, no markings, nothing personal, just raw cement and silence. He realized he was still wearing the hotel bathrobe. The thin fabric felt wrong against his skin, out of place. It made everything worse. He had been taken without even the dignity of proper clothes, and that detail bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Someone was sitting opposite him. The chair scraped softly against the floor when the figure adjusted position. The man stayed just outside the brightest part of the light. Safwat could see a body, a head, the suggestion of crossed legs, but no clear face. When the man finally spoke, the Arabic was correct, but stiff. The accent gave him away. This was not a native speaker. It was the sound of someone who had studied the language in classrooms, not learned it at home. "General Safwat," the man said, "welcome. I apologize for the setting. It is not ideal, but it is temporary." Safwat pulled against the restraints, testing them out of habit. They did not give. The chair barely moved. He forced his breathing to slow. Training took over. This was always a theoretical risk, something discussed and then dismissed. Senior Egyptian intelligence officers were not meant to disappear from neutral territory, not from a hotel room in Geneva. There were rules, quiet agreements.
Lines that were not crossed, even by enemies. "You are making a serious mistake," Safwat said. His voice stayed even, though his stomach tightened. "Egypt will not allow this. There will be consequences." The man in the shadows shifted again, as if amused. "Egypt will say nothing," he replied. "Your government cannot admit that a high-ranking intelligence officer was taken from a hotel in Geneva. The humiliation would be too great. They will say you defected, or they will pretend you never existed. Either option is easier than the truth. No one is coming for you." The silence that followed felt deliberate, measured. Then the questioning began. It would continue for 11 days. The methods were precise and controlled. No chaos, no wasted effort. Psychological pressure came first, steady and relentless. Physical pain followed in careful doses, never enough to cause lasting damage, always enough to break resistance. Every detail was planned. Every pause had a purpose. Sleep deprivation was the main method, backed up by control of temperature and the constant not knowing of what would come next. The room was kept either too cold or uncomfortably warm, sometimes changing without warning. Safwat was allowed to eat and drink, but never at set times. Food appeared without pattern, just enough to keep him functioning. Water was offered often, but always on their terms. He was permitted to rest, but never longer than an hour at once, and sometimes much less. Just as he began to drift off, someone would wake him and lead him back for more questioning. The interrogations ran around the clock. Different interrogators came in at random intervals. Some were calm, others blunt. But they asked the same questions again and again, each time from a new angle. The goal was not speed, but erosion. They wanted precise information. They asked for the names of Mukhabara assets working inside Israel, especially anyone who might have reached Israeli intelligence or military institutions. They pressed for details about Egyptian military strength, unit locations, readiness levels, and plans prepared for different conflict scenarios. They asked about Soviet weapon systems still held by Egypt, their condition, how well they were maintained, and whether they could be used on short notice. They also focused on ties between Egyptian intelligence and other Arab services, especially Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and how information moved between them. At first, Safwat gave them nothing of value. He stated his name and rank and repeated that his detention violated international law. He said little else. The interrogators did not argue. They listened, acknowledged what he said, and continued as if his answers were expected. There was no visible anger and no rush. They showed him photographs of his family. They did not threaten harm or make promises. The images were presented quietly, as reminders of his life outside the room and what could be affected by his choices.
They played recordings of intercepted communications, letting him hear voices and details that proved how deeply Israeli intelligence had already penetrated networks he believed were secure. Over time, the tone shifted. He was offered water, then coffee, then meals that were better than what he might have received in a military prison. The contrast was deliberate. Comfort appeared briefly, then vanished again. By the 6th day, exhaustion and isolation had worn down his resistance. His sense of time was blurred, and his confidence in what the interrogators already knew was gone. During one session, an interrogator entered who stood out from the others. She spoke softly and moved slowly, her manner gentle against the harsh setting. Instead of repeating the usual demands, she asked about a specific operation. Safwat froze. He believed that operation was known only to a small group of Egyptian officials. It involved placing an asset inside the Israeli defense establishment. At that moment, he understood how narrow the gap had become between what he was protecting and what they were about to take. He had been feeding information to Cairo for nearly 3 years, and by the time the interrogator spoke the code name aloud, Safwat knew it was over. The moment that name was mentioned, he understood that resistance was pointless. The Israelis were far deeper into the picture than he had ever believed possible. They already knew the shape of the network, the habits, and the weak points. Keeping quiet would not shield anyone. Holding out would only stretch the process and add more pain, without changing the outcome. Once that reality set in, the tone of the interrogation shifted. Over the following days, Safwat began to talk. What he shared would later alter Israeli counterintelligence work for years. He identified the penetration agent at the center of the operation, a low-level clerical worker inside the defense ministry. That man had been moving sensitive documents through a carefully layered chain of intermediaries designed to blur the source and protect the end handlers. Safwat explained how the chain functioned, who managed each step, and where it had already shown signs of strain. He went on to describe Egyptian surveillance efforts aimed at Israeli diplomatic facilities across Europe and the Middle East. He outlined how teams were assigned, how cover identities were maintained, and how information was passed back to Cairo. He also broke down the structure of mukhabarat networks operating inside Palestinian refugee camps. He named key assets, explained their roles, and described the communication protocols they relied on to avoid detection. Throughout the process, the interrogators documented everything. They cross-checked his statements against what they already held, stopping him when details were vague or timelines did not line up. When answers were incomplete, they pushed for clarity. What surprised Safwat most was the method.
He had expected violence, threats, and humiliation. None of that came. He was treated with steady, professional courtesy from start to finish. Later, he would admit to himself that this approach worked better than force ever could. They did not break him with pain. They broke him by showing, piece by piece, that his secrets were already exposed. Every confirmation removed another reason to resist. On the 11th day, they told him the interrogation was finished. He would be released through a channel designed to preserve appearances on both sides. Egypt would take him back without admitting that anything unusual had happened. Israel would keep the intelligence he had given up without revealing how it had been obtained. The shadow war would go on as it always had, but there was now a difference that mattered. Cairo would understand that even its most senior intelligence officers were not beyond reach. That knowledge would sit quietly in the background, shaping Egyptian decisions and operations for many years afterward. The release was handled quietly through a chain of intermediaries based in Cyprus. The island was selected on purpose. It was easy to reach, politically convenient, and had long served as a neutral meeting point for indirect contacts between states that officially refused to speak to one another. The arrangement allowed all sides to deny involvement while still getting what they wanted. Safwat was taken by car to Geneva airport. The trip was tightly controlled. He was placed on a regular commercial flight to Larnaca, not a private aircraft, to avoid attention. Mossad operatives monitored the process from start to finish. They stayed out of sight but made sure there were no delays, no interference, and no last-minute problems. The departure went smoothly, exactly as planned. After landing in Cyprus, Safwat was brought to a hotel near the waterfront. It was a location chosen for its anonymity and steady flow of foreign visitors. Egyptian officials arrived shortly after and took custody of him without discussion. They did not ask where he had been held, who had questioned him, or what had taken place during his absence. The transfer was purely procedural. Once it was done, the matter was treated as closed. Egypt's official reaction was complete silence. There were no diplomatic notes, no formal complaints, and no public remarks of any kind. State media said nothing. Foreign ministries remained inactive. Intelligence services on both sides continued operating as if the event had never occurred, maintaining the appearance of normal routine. Inside Egypt, Safwat's fate was settled discreetly. He was removed from active duty and placed into early retirement. There was no trial and no public accusation.
His career did not end with scandal, but with quiet exclusion. He was classified among those officers reassigned or dismissed for vague, undisclosed reasons. He remained in Cairo for the rest of his life, largely isolated.
Former colleagues kept their distance. Security agencies maintained periodic surveillance, never fully restoring their trust in him. From the perspective of Mossad, the operation was judged a clear success. Information extracted from Safwat led directly to the exposure of the penetration agent inside the defense ministry. That discovery allowed Israeli intelligence to shut down a critical leak that had undermined several operations. Damage was contained and future losses were prevented. The methods used in Geneva proved especially valuable. The blend of technical monitoring and psychological pressure became a model for later missions. These techniques were refined, standardized, and reused. The decision to carry out an extraction on neutral ground also sent a lasting message. It showed a level of reach and confidence that rival intelligence services took into account for many years afterward. The diplomatic fallout was limited. As David had anticipated, Switzerland filed no formal protest. There was no proof that any illegal activity had taken place on its soil. Without evidence, there was nothing to pursue. Egypt, for its part, could not acknowledge what had happened without admitting that its intelligence apparatus had been compromised and that a senior officer had been taken by a foreign service. Silence was the only viable option. Israel chose to stay silent and placed the operation into classified files that recorded its hidden reach and methods. Nothing was said in public and no official comment was ever made. Inside the intelligence world, though, the details did not stay secret for long. Information moved through quiet conversations and trusted contacts. Soon the account of how Mossad had taken an Egyptian general from a hotel in Geneva began to circulate. It turned into one more story that shaped the image of Israeli intelligence. It carried a clear message. No rank or protection was absolute if the situation required action. Other intelligence services paid close attention. Some viewed the operation with respect, others with unease. Many understood that the informal rules of covert conflict had shifted, even if only slightly. Assumptions about safety and distance no longer held the same weight. The mission became a reference point in internal studies and quiet briefings, even if no one spoke of it openly. The team that carried out the extraction did not stay together. Once the task was complete, its members moved on to different assignments, as was standard practice. David continued working and steadily advanced through the organization. Over time, he reached senior roles and eventually retired in the late 1990s. Yusuf and Miriam remained paired on later operations. Their effectiveness and trust in each other earned them a strong reputation inside the service. Over the years, their cooperation was spoken of as an example of how such partnerships should function.
The support personnel faded back into the background of intelligence work. They returned to routine roles within systems designed to leave no visible trace. Their efforts were recorded only in restricted files and known solely to those with the right level of clearance. No public recognition followed, and none was expected. The safe house in France was carefully cleaned and shut down. The basement room was stripped of anything unusual and returned to a condition that suggested nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened there. The vehicles involved were either sold off through indirect channels or destroyed. No physical trace was allowed to remain. All documents and audio recordings from the interrogation were transferred to Tel Aviv. Analysts reviewed them in detail, pulling out every usable detail and cross-checking it against existing intelligence. Once that process was complete, the original materials were sealed away in archives. Those files were marked to remain classified for generations. General Mahmoud Safwat died in 1997. His death received only brief mention in Egyptian newspapers. He was described simply as a retired military officer, with no reference to his intelligence work. His family was granted a pension that matched his rank in years of service. Former colleagues attended a funeral that was restrained by Egyptian military standards. Their presence was a sign of respect for a man whose true importance could never be publicly stated. By the time the story ended, the rain that had fallen over Geneva that November evening was already gone. The streets were dry and clean, with nothing to suggest that an operation had taken place there only hours earlier. Traffic moved as usual. Lights glowed in shop windows. People walked past without a second thought. Inside the Intercontinental Hotel, diplomats, executives, and guests checked in and out, unaware of what had happened in room 517. The hotel staff followed their routines. Cleaners moved carts down the hallways. Bellmen handled luggage. No one noticed that the same service corridors and loading docks used during the extraction were now just part of an ordinary workday. Those spaces blended back into daily life as if nothing out of the ordinary had ever passed through them. Far from Switzerland, in Tel Aviv, the records tied to Operation Geneva were sealed away. The files sat in secure storage, restricted to a small circle of senior officials with the highest level of clearance. They were not reviewed often. When they were, it was usually for instruction.
Experienced officers pulled the documents to train the next generation. They broke down the planning, the timing, the coordination, and the careful handling of diplomatic fallout. Recruits studied each step in detail. They learned how decisions were made under pressure and how mistakes were avoided. These were lessons no classroom or textbook could offer. The conflict itself never stopped.
It continued quietly, away from public attention. Nations fought each other without declarations or uniforms. Men and women carried out missions, knowing their names would never be published or honored. They worked in the narrow space between what governments admitted and what actually happened. Their actions were designed to leave no proof, no statements, and no official acknowledgement. The extraction of General Safwad was just one moment in that long hidden struggle. It stood out for its boldness, but it was not unique. Similar operations had taken place before and would take place again. What made this one worth remembering was not the level of force or the technical difficulty. It was the clarity of the message it delivered. Intelligence work does not recognize neutral territory. There is no ground that remains untouched when the stakes are high enough. Safety is temporary. Rules exist only until someone decides they no longer apply. The general believed that diplomatic norms and physical distance would shield him. He assumed that certain lines would not be crossed. That belief gave him a sense of security he did not deserve. That misplaced trust became the weakness that Mossad identified and used. The operation was carried out with calm focus and precise timing. Every assumption the general relied on was turned against him. Other intelligence agencies took note. They understood the meaning behind what had happened. The lesson was clear, and it was remembered. In the years that came after, senior officers who traveled overseas became more cautious by habit. They altered daily routines, changed departure times, and avoided patterns that could be tracked. Security details were enlarged, routes were checked twice, and familiar hotels were skipped if there was any chance their presence could be anticipated. These steps helped, but they never solved the deeper problem revealed by the Geneva operation. The world had changed. Technology now allowed monitoring, tracking, and rapid communication on a scale earlier generations would not have believed possible. Anyone involved in the operation remained exposed in some way. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Even after decades had passed, the memories did not fade. The final approach stayed sharp in their minds. So did the careful timing, the exact movements, and the extraction carried out with no room for error. There was also the long drive through rain-soaked countryside toward the French border, marked by silence and focus. Those hours shaped their professional lives. The operation defined reputations and followed them into every assignment that came later. It confirmed that Mossad could act anywhere, against any target, and that the consequences would be absorbed by a world forced to move on. The operation also revealed a truth about intelligence work that outsiders rarely grasped. Real success did not come from open conflict or public drama.
It came from restraint, planning, and outcomes that left nothing visible behind. The most effective missions were the ones that never appeared in the news, that stayed classified for generations, and that achieved their goals without signaling that anything had happened at all. Judged by that standard, Geneva stood as a model. It worked because it was quiet, controlled, and precise. By the time David reached the train station that evening, the rain had stopped. The pavement was still wet, and the streetlights reflected off the surface as cars passed by. He bought a ticket to Zurich, planning to stay there overnight before continuing on to Tel Aviv the next day. The platform was almost empty at that hour. Only a few travelers waited, absorbed in their own thoughts, paying no attention to the ordinary man in the gray overcoat standing nearby. When the train finally left Geneva, David settled into his seat and allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction. The job was done, and the city was already behind him. The operation unfolded exactly as it had been drawn up. Nothing went wrong. No one was lost. No unexpected turns appeared at the last moment. The general was taken into custody without resistance, and the unit began to split up almost immediately, each group moving along its assigned route. The intelligence that justified the entire mission was already being pulled apart, sorted, and logged. By the time morning came, Safwat would already be deep into a process that led only in one direction. Step by step, revelation followed by surrender. Outside the car window, the Swiss countryside slid past in silence. The land was still dark,
interrupted now and then by small pockets of light from villages, isolated homes, and working farms. David looked out, but he wasn't really watching. His eyes were open, yet his thoughts were elsewhere. They had already moved on to what came next. Another operation, another name, another quiet conflict that would never be acknowledged. The kind of war that happens out of sight while the rest of the world carries on, unaware that anything has shifted. This had been his life for more than 20 years. It had shaped him completely. He could not picture himself doing anything else, and he no longer tried. In a basement room just across the border, General Safwat was starting to grasp that nothing would ever return to how it had been. The interrogation had not begun yet. No questions had been asked. Still, the outcome was obvious. He was alone, cut off. Every layer of protection he had built over decades of service was gone. No allies, no leverage, no chain of command left to shield him. The network of secrets he had spent his career assembling was now exposed, ready to be taken apart slowly and methodically by men who did not rush and never needed to raise their voices. They relied on time, silence, and certainty. The Geneva operation stayed classified for many decades.
Only the people directly involved and the senior officials who had approved it ever knew what truly happened. No government lodged a formal complaint. No headlines appeared. No reporters chased rumors, because there were none to chase. Safwat spent the rest of his life in quiet anonymity, far from power or influence. Yet the information he gave up continued to shape Israeli intelligence work long after the Cold War had ended. In espionage, the events that matter most are often the ones that leave no visible mark at all. That raises a simple question. When national security is on the line, should intelligence agencies be allowed to operate without regard for borders?